Maritime disasters test human courage, yet the sinking of the SS Arctic revealed the darkest corners of the human spirit. As the world moved toward industrial greatness, the promise of progress was shattered in 1854 when more than 300 souls, most of them women and children, were lost in the cold Atlantic. In the most desperate moments, the crew, driven by panic and fear, seized the lifeboats, abandoning those who needed help, even the owner's own family, with their cries swallowed by chaos. People made considerable efforts to bridge the Atlantic Ocean through regular, rapid, and luxurious steam travel. This achievement became a symbol of national pride and technological progress. At the heart of this transatlantic race was the Collins Line. The Collins Line was America's answer to the formidable British Cunard Line. Their flagship, the magnificent side-wheel steamer SS Arctic, was more than just a ship. She was a floating monument to American ingenuity. Launched in 1850, at 284 feet, she was one of the largest and fastest passenger ships of her time, carrying over 250 passengers and plenty of cargo. Her interiors, made of fine wood and ornate furnishings, along with a grand saloon, earned her the nickname Clipper of the Seas. On the 21st of September 1854, the Arctic left Liverpool heading for New York. On board were hundreds of individuals, wealthy merchants, and the crew sworn to protect them. The passenger list included some of New York's most notable families. Among them was the family of Edward Knight Collins, the line's founder, travelling home. This voyage was supposed to be a victorious return. Instead, it turned into one of the era's most tragic maritime disasters. The sinking of the Arctic was no freak accident. It was the result of the challenges and cutthroat competition that marked 19th century maritime travel. In the 1850s, the North Atlantic was a proving ground, a commercial battlefield where speed was the ultimate goal. The Collins Line and Cunard Line were fierce rivals. Government mail contracts and passenger fares were awarded to the company that consistently delivered the fastest crossings. This encouraged captains to push their mighty yet still developing steamships to the limit, regardless of conditions. Although powerful, the ships of the era had glaring limitations. Navigation was rudimentary by modern standards. While compasses and chronometers were standard, the primary methods of avoiding collisions relied on basic human observation, or lookouts, and crude signalling systems. The most formidable foe, however, was the environment. The route between Europe and North America often crossed the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland, a rich fishing ground where the warm Gulf Stream meets the cold Labrador Current. This meeting point is famous for generating thick, impenetrable fog banks that can persist for days, reducing visibility to mere feet. The environment became the ultimate variable, the one factor that the pride and engineering of the Collins Line could not overcome. The prevailing belief was that the large, heavily built and rapid steamer was simply too formidable to be sunk by anything other than an extraordinary storm. This hubris, rooted in technological faith and commercial pressure, set the stage for the imminent catastrophe. After the ship left Liverpool, England, the early days of the Arctic's homeward journey were uneventful. Captain James Luce, a veteran and highly respected mariner, commanded the ship. His experience and the ship's reputation offered considerable reassurance to the 400-plus people aboard. As the Arctic neared the Grand Banks on the morning of the 27th of September 1854, thick, blinding fog surrounded the ship. The competitive race required Captain Luce to maintain speed despite poor visibility. Although the steam whistle sounded at intervals, the vessel pressed forward through the grey shroud. This decision, driven by commercial necessity, placed the Arctic directly in the path of an unforeseen danger. The tension in the fog became reality. A vessel, seemingly appearing from nowhere, loomed directly ahead. It was the French iron-screw steamer SS Vesta, a much smaller, slower vessel. The Arctic speed made a complete stop impossible, and Captain Luce's evasive manoeuvre came too late. At approximately 12:15 p.m, a sudden impact shattered the fog's silence. The smaller SS Vesta rammed the SS Arctic on its starboard side, just ahead of the Arctic's massive paddle box. Although the Arctic was larger and faster, its wooden hull couldn't match the iron-hulled Vesta. The Arctic was gouged below the waterline, causing a catastrophic breach. Initially, the Arctic's crew, hearing a sound one passenger described as a dull, heavy thud, believed their own ship was only lightly damaged, while the Vesta was clearly sinking. Captain Luce quickly ordered a survey of the Arctic's bow. The report that returned was devastating. The Arctic had suffered a catastrophic breach. The momentum of the collision, combined with Vesta's sharp bow, had opened a massive gash below the waterline. The Pride of the Collins Line was fatally wounded and rapidly taking on water. The realization that the Arctic was doomed triggered immediate, complete panic, a stark contrast to the discipline that once defined the ship's operations. In the 19th century, safety procedures were rudimentary at best. Maritime safety protocols were still in their infancy, often lacking formalized drills or clear lines of command during emergencies. The absence of structured emergency plans meant crews relied on ad hoc measures rather than order and preparedness. The Arctic, like many ships of its time, did not hold regular safety drills, and crew members were not trained to manage mass evacuations systematically. As a result, when disaster struck, the crew, rather than maintaining order, devolved into a desperate mob fighting for survival, leaving chaos in its wake. The first shock of the collision gave way to horror, as a cruel truth became undeniable. Survival for many was already impossible. The grand ship carried far too few lifeboats for those on board. Instead of offering hope, the lifeboats became symbols of impending doom. The crew, who should have been saviors, became the very agents of tragedy, as panic eclipsed order, turning rescue into a nightmare. The limited lifeboats were not systematically lowered for the desperate passengers. Instead, they were commandeered by much of the crew, many of whom were hired in Liverpool. They betrayed their duty by releasing the boats and rowing frantically away, abandoning terrified passengers to their fate. The first and second officers failed to maintain order, upending not only the social hierarchy and duty structure, but also any illusion of safety. Within 2 hours of the collision, the Arctic began to settle into the cold waters. The engines had been stopped, and the rising water doused the coal fires. All hope of keeping her afloat vanished. Captain Luce, crushed by betrayal and his crew's desertion, summoned what resolve he had left. He pleaded for order, urging that women and children, the most vulnerable, be given a final chance at life. The last lifeboats became battlefields. Men surged forward, pushing aside mothers and children in a frantic, heartless rush. Every cry, every plea for mercy seemed to vanish into the cold, indifferent air. Captain Luce, having failed to save his passengers, acted as he felt was honourable. He remained on the bridge, refusing to abandon his post. As the Arctic finally gave up her struggle and slid beneath the waves, taking hundreds of people with her, Luce was sucked down into the whirlpool, along with his 11-year-old son. Miraculously, he surfaced near a piece of the paddle box and clung to it, but the paddle box crushed his son's head, killing him. After clinging to the paddle box wreckage for 2 days, Luce and a few other survivors were rescued by the ship Cambria, bound for Quebec. The final tally was grim. Over 300 lives were lost, including all the women and children aboard. Of approximately 400 people, only 85 survived. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the French ship Vesta, though badly damaged, did not sink. The news of the ship's sinking reached New York, with painful delay. As the scattered survivors began arriving at various ports aboard fishing boats and passing steamers, the full horror of the disaster was revealed. The public reaction was one of utter devastation and outrage. This was the first significant loss of a transatlantic steamer, and the sheer scale of the tragedy, coupled with the crew's shameful conduct, shocked the nation. The aftermath sparked intense scrutiny and calls for accountability. The fact that almost every woman and child perished while a large percentage of the crew survived by selfishly commandeering the lifeboats became the central and most damning feature of the disaster. Although there was a strong public outcry for legal action, the maritime laws at the time were insufficient to prosecute such negligence. As a result, no significant legal consequences befell the crew or the Collins Line, highlighting the need for substantial reforms in maritime safety standards and accountability measures. The most profound victim of the disaster was the family of the line's founder, Edward Knight Collins, which lost his wife, son, and one daughter. The devastation was personal to the company's head. While the disaster did not immediately lead to revolutionary changes in maritime safety, it fundamentally altered public perception of sea travel. It challenged the prevailing hubris about technology and initiated a slow yet necessary process of reform. The tragedy made it impossible to ignore the severe lack of lifeboats on passenger vessels. The most immediate and tangible reform following the disaster was the voluntary adoption of transatlantic sea lanes to reduce the risk of collisions in fog, a system proposed by Lieutenant Matthew Fontaine Maury in 1855. The disaster led to more frequent use of steam whistles for signaling and to the standardization of red and green sidelights to improve visibility. Technological advances also inspired improvements in ship design and safety features. Shipbuilders began incorporating watertight bulkheads more frequently to prevent damage from spreading. If one or more compartments flood, the others remain dry, keeping the ship afloat and stable. The breakdown in discipline led to increased discussion of the need for rigorous lifeboat drills and severe punishment for crew members who abandoned passengers. Unfortunately, significant legislative changes were slow to materialize and would not come about until the tragic sinking of the Titanic. Only then did pressure mount for ships to carry enough lifeboats to accommodate all persons aboard, including increased emphasis on lifeboat drills. The Collins Line never fully recovered from the loss of the Arctic and the subsequent sinking of her sister ship, the SS Pacific, a year later, which vanished without a trace. Competition, costs, and the two major disasters broke the company. And by 1858, the proud American enterprise was bankrupt. The sinking of the Arctic remains a chilling and crucial, yet largely forgotten chapter in American history, a stark reminder that, in the age of steam, man was still a captive of the sea,